what she used because I checked with the doctor. And my pain prescription was in there and gone, but the doctor said that it wasn't enough.
Jurors hear recordings of the defendant in the Missouri case of Rebecca Rood as she stands trial for the murder of her teenage daughter. And
the memory I'll take away from today that I will never forget until the rest of my, for the rest of my life, was hearing Ghislaine walk into court with chains.
We sit down with abuse survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and his recently sentenced madam, Ghislaine Maxwell. Plus, more delays for the Parkland school shooter as a jury is finalized and ready for his Florida trial to begin. But first, R&B singer R. Kelly faces sentencing for his crimes related to sex trafficking and racketeering.
They said that they were enticed by R. Kelly, who promised them fame. A lot of them were hoping to become celebrities themselves.
Law&Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law&Crime Daily. I'm your host, Brian Buckmire. R&B artist Robert Kelly, known as R. Kelly, is sentenced to 30 years at a sentencing hearing in a Brooklyn federal court Wednesday. Kelly was convicted last September on all 9 federal charges against him, including racketeering and sex trafficking. He pled not guilty and didn't take the stand in his own defense for his role in a scheme to recruit women and underage children for sex. Federal prosecutors requested a sentence in excess of 25 years. Kelly's attorney had asked for a shorter sentence of less than 14 years. He now faces 30 years behind bars and a $100,000 fine. A restitution hearing is set for September. Law&Crime Sarah Gillespie was inside the courtroom as several survivors of Kelly's abuse spoke before the judge and to Kelly.
These were really emotional for a lot of the women to get through, and even for a spectator to listen on. They detailed what they called modern-day slavery. They said that they were enticed by R. Kelly, who promised them fame. A lot of them were hoping to become celebrities themselves, who were aspiring singers, young underage girls, many of which in the Miami area, who Kelly reached out to. And at first they thought, okay, this is a mentorship program. I'm going to learn something. And instead, it's what they called modern day slavery. A lot of them said they had been diagnosed with depression, trauma, PTSD, and a lot of them said that Kelly does not show any sign of remorse. This is something that multiple of the victims, or survivors, I should say, touched on. They said they believe that Kelly has a God complex, that he used this to groom young women, girls, boys for his own sexual gratification. And many of them said he shows no empathy even today. So many of them felt that they were still being disrespected by R. Kelly, even at his federal sentencing.
Joining us today is former SWAT and detective Lisa Lockwood and co-host Terri Austin. Lisa, what was your reaction to the victim impact statements? We heard a little bit of it there. And how do you think they affected the judge when deciding R. Kelly's sentence?
Oh, without a doubt, it had a huge effect on the judge. Because listen, there's a documentary made. A lot of these women were participating in that. We heard about dog collars being worn. We heard about videotaping and using that to try to influence them not to go forward, kind of like revenge porn. There was so much exposed in that documentary. I mean, there's no doubt that the judge listened to these incredible survivors who had endured all of this and really agreed that this was the proper way to go as far as 30 years and throwing the book at him.
Yeah. Now, Terri, do you think the judge came to the right number here, especially considering what both sides are asking for? And do you think Kelly should have made a statement?
You know, I do think the judge came down with the right number. She looked at the sentencing guidelines. She took into account all of the victim impact statements. And she said she even took into account R. Kelly's history, his traumatic history. But at the end of the day, it was what happened to those victims. She directly talked to him and said to him what he did to those victims. And I think she decided that 30 was sufficient, but that it was necessary. And so she wanted to make sure that she gave him a number that reflected the crimes that he did. And all of these victims, all of these survivors were very young at the time. So I think it was the right number. And he couldn't say anything because he's facing other charges. We know he's going in August to face charges in Chicago. So he has to be careful what he says.
Yeah, he's also got a case in Georgia as well. So it's a lot on the line for R. Kelly and probably many more years to add to those 30 years. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, after nearly 3 months, a jury is seated as the case of the Parkland school shooter sees another delay. But first, we're hearing from Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's abuse survivors for the first time after the madam is sentenced to decades in prison. Welcome back. Former Jeffrey Epstein madam Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison on Tuesday. And after the sentencing hearing, Law and Crime sat down with 2 of the pair's abuse survivors. Law and Crime covered Maxwell's trial extensively until she was ultimately convicted in December of 5 of the 6 federal felony charges she was charged with, including sex trafficking of a minor. Prosecutors proved to the jury that the 60-year-old recruited and groomed young teenage girls for longtime companion Epstein, who faced similar charges back in 2019. He was found dead by suicide in his jail cell before his case could go to trial. Maxwell did not testify in her own defense during the trial, but at her sentencing, she did address the abuse survivors before the sentence was handed down. She acknowledged she had been convicted, but stopped short of taking responsibility for her crimes. Several of Epstein and Maxwell's abuse survivors also spoke at the sentencing. Law and Crime host Michael Bryant had the opportunity to sit down with Elizabeth Stein after the hearing. She shared what it was like being just feet away from her abuser in court.
This was the first time I actually saw her look like a prisoner. And maybe seeing that visual, not seeing glamorous Ghislaine, seeing her that way also gave me some solace. You know, it's been asserted that her meeting Jeffrey Epstein was the worst mistake she ever made, and it may well be. She didn't have to choose to pass on the trauma. She didn't have to choose that. She chose, in my estimation, what seemed to be the easier route. It's easy to live well. It's easy to have all the things that you want and all the friends that you want and all the connections. You know, looking at someone's humanity is a different thing, and I just don't feel like she is yet able to look at us in a human way.
We also spoke with a second survivor, Sarah Ransom. She told us how she felt seeing Maxwell in court. We want to warn you, given the nature of this case, the following soundbite has sensitive content.
The thing for me, the memory I'll take away from today that I will never forget until the rest of my, for the rest of my life, was hearing Ghislaine walk into court with chains. And that was a very somber but liberating moment for me, because there's no more games. I just heard the clinking, clink, clink, clink. I'm disappointed. I don't feel that Ghislaine took accountability and responsibility really for the victims. I think that was her addressing the victims was a bit of a sham, saying I'm sorry. I have a particular issue with saying I'm sorry, because not at one point when I was being raped every single day, sometimes for 3 times a day, to 3 times a day, when Ghislaine herself, by her own hand, forced me into Jeffrey Epstein's room to be raped, did she say I'm sorry? I've spent the last 17 years trying to get some form of justice, trying to put together a life for myself, and I haven't been able to do that until today.
All right, we have a former detective and a former civil rights attorney, so I think I'm just gonna listen and let you two talk about your reaction to the interviews of these Maxwell survivors. Terri, you first.
Brian, you know, these women spoke truth to power, and you have to think about all of the survivors of all of these individuals who are being prosecuted now. They go through the incident, and then they have to get the trial, and it takes a long time to get these cases prosecuted. And then they have to go through the trial, and then they have to see what happens after the trial if there's a conviction. And in both those interviews, what we heard was we saw Ghislaine Maxwell come into that courtroom, and finally she's in chains. Finally, she's not wearing rich, expensive clothes. So I think there's a little bit of closure for all of these survivors, that they've finally come to the end of this road. It doesn't take away what occurred, but it does give them some solace, a little bit of closure that these people have been prosecuted and that they have now been sentenced to jail.
And Lisa, your reaction?
These ladies, these women who were once the children, young ladies who were sexually abused, and in proximity of Ghislaine during all of it, never felt at any point that Ghislaine had their backs, that Ghislaine was there to support them, to help their lives in any way. They were used as a tool for Ghislaine in order to supply Jeffrey Epstein's incredible animalistic sex life. And now, after all of these years, they've tried so hard to get their life on track because they thought maybe one day there will be justice. And now we finally have it. These women have their justice that they were searching, and now they can move on to better heal.
Thank you, Lisa and Terry. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, a jury is finalized and the trial delayed again for the Parkland school shooter. Plus, in Missouri, prosecutors play a recording of Rebecca Rude's account of discovering her daughter's death as she faces charges for her murder. Welcome back to Law and Crime Daily. In Florida, a jury has been selected in the penalty phase trial for Parkland school shooter, as the case is delayed again. Back in October, he pled guilty to killing 17 people in the February 2018 mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The incident sparked nationwide conversations about gun control measures and mental health. A 12-panel jury will decide whether the 23-year-old should spend the rest of his life in prison or be put to death. Jurors will consider whether several aggravating factors, including his planning and cruelty, outweigh his history of mental and emotional problems. The jury of 7 men and 5 women finalized on Tuesday was narrowed down over nearly 3 months from 1,800 candidates. 10 alternates were also selected. The trial, which was rescheduled to July 6th, is now being pushed back and is set to begin on July 18th. Terri, why did it make sense to move the date from the 6th of July to July 18th? Was that the right move, and could it be the last move?
Well, let's hope it's the last move, Brian. Judge Shearer did say this was going to be the last delay. This happened back in February 2018. And so now, years later, we are finally getting to trial. But this is the biggest mass murder shooting that we've had that has gone to trial. And so it's very important that they get it right. And the issue, obviously, is life and death. So you have to think that there will be experts who talk about the death sentence. They want to make sure that the jury has all of the information in front of them. So this time will give them a little bit more time to get all of the information in line and make sure that they have what they need to do the best they can, either to prosecute the case or even defend the case, obviously. So I think that it made sense, and it's after the 4th of July. Who knows? Maybe it'll give them a little break, and then the case will go forward with no further delays.
Yeah, let's hope the potential jurors aren't talking about the case on the 4th of July as well. But Lisa, as a former law enforcement agent, you must have had to wait as cases drag on before you can testify to get some sort of justice for victims. What do you think it's like for the victims' families to have to wait while as justice is delayed like this?
Brian, it's excruciating. This is over 4 years, February 14th of 2018. And just as they're getting close to the date, it's around the corner, it's like a carpet is being pulled out from under them. No, not again, not again. Because 17 people we lost, 14 students, 3 staff members, and to think about everybody surrounding those families who just want to move on with their lives. It is the hardest thing in the world. And the court system is not as expedient as we would like it to be, but we need to do better.
Yeah, like you said, like knowing that it's coming and then saying, oh, no, 12 more days or 5 more days, like that's got to be the worst. Well, hopefully it comes up soon. When we come back, an audio recording of the defendant is played in court in the Missouri trial of Rebecca Rood as she faces first-degree murder for the death of her teenage daughter. Welcome back. A St. Louis police officer takes the stand in the Missouri trial of DeJuan Ferguson, a man being tried for the nearly 2-decade-old murder of his son who had special needs. Christian Ferguson was just 9 years old when he went missing. Christian had a rare disorder which prevented his body from processing protein properly, a condition which needed constant medical attention and interfered with his ability to walk and talk. Prosecutors say Ferguson failed to provide his son with proper medication for more than 2 years. The day Christian disappeared, June 11, 2003, Ferguson left his home with his son and stopped to use a payphone. Moments later, he called 911 to report someone had carjacked his running SUV with Christian inside. The vehicle was later found hours later, just a few miles away. Christian's body was never found. An officer who arrived on scene when Christian was reported missing described his first interaction with the defendant.
Did you ever speak with Mr. Ferguson?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And when you spoke with him, what did he say to you?
I heard, I can't for 20 years back look at it and say, these are the exact words spoken. I don't have the memory for it. But what struck me at that time was he was a regular victim. He was every victim that I had dealt with in all those years. He was upset, he was nervous, he was pacing.
Also in Missouri, both sides rest their case as Rebecca Rood faces first-degree murder charges for the death of her 16-year-old daughter. Prosecutors say Rood murdered her 16-year-old daughter, Savannah Leckie, back in 2017. Savannah had special needs and had previously been adopted, though Rood's biological daughter, Savannah, was adopted by another couple as a baby. When she began struggling with behavioral problems as a teen, Savannah moved back in with her biological mother, Rood, and her boyfriend, Robert P. 11 months later, Rood reported her daughter missing. Prosecutors say Rood abused Savannah and that she and Pete eventually killed her and burned her body in June of 2017. Investigators searched their Ozark County farm and found bone fragments and teeth in a burn pile. In opening statements, Rood's attorney argued Savannah killed herself and that Rood admits to burning her daughter. Rood's husband and co-defendant Robert Pete Jr. testified Tuesday. Investigators say he turned over recordings to them from the defendant's interview with a member of the public defender's office.
Where was Savannah when you went to the camper?
In bed.
Okay.
She laid down, and I tried to wake her up to give her an antibiotic for the infection in her hand. And
Did Savannah kill herself?
I don't know what she used because I checked with the doctor.
Well, you
And my pain prescription was in there and gone, but the doctor said that it wasn't enough, so she had to take in something else, and I don't have any. So I don't know what she used. There was no blood in
the
it.
doctor.
Dr. Bryan, when Robert took me to the doctor to get medication for Savannah, he gave me a prescription of Vicodin. And I went back the next week and I asked if that was enough to kill her, and he said no. I asked him, I don't know what she used. The only other thing I can think of is I have some fly bait I use to poison coons, but I don't know how she could. This just smells awful.
Lisa, Pete Jr. held on to these recordings for over a year, then gave it to the police. Does how the police got it affect what was said on the recording?
Well, that's the big question right now. And it appears that they permitted that evidence to come into court because she willingly gave that to him and said, put this away for safekeeping. And he held on to it. He said he never even listened to it. And then when he finally did listen to it, that's when he felt that he needed to go forward with it. And let's not forget, he's also charged and he also has a trial going forward. So it's very likely that he thought that this would help him in a future trial if he came clean with this information.
Yeah, if she's convicted and gets X amount of years, it's going to be very curious to me, at least, as to what kind of plea deal that he ultimately gets, because he's obviously testifying for something. It seems he's cooperated in some way, shape, or form in many ways. Well, Terri, do you believe Pete Jr.? I mean, he came and testified. A lot of people saying it's kind of a nothing burger, but it's supposed to help the prosecution. Or do you think that he did it alone, that being killing Savannah Leckie?
Here's what I think, Brian. I think the two of them together killed Savannah. There's no question that as a parent and as a spouse taking care of a child, you are supposed to understand and know what medications they have, and you are supposed to give those medications and make sure there's no harm to the child. And here you see they're saying different things. We heard the defense say in the opening statement for Rude that she didn't kill Savannah, but she burned the body. You don't burn a body if you aren't involved with the killing. And now we hear Pete talking about the fact that there is this, recording, and he's finally giving it over, but he's trying to protect himself. No question about it. I think you're right about that. You have these two defendants, and one is trying to save himself, and so he turns over the recording to get himself out of trouble.
All right, we'll see how this case continues. Like you said, moving towards closing statements. Well, thank you both, and thank you for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.